My mother was still speaking when my brother stepped forward. She had just said the words, "Your father told me before he died that he wanted me to have everything." And they hung there over the open grave with 73 people standing around in the cold October wind. Dirt piled to the side. The vault still visible through the frost. Daniel didn't wait. He pulled the folded document from inside his jacket. Not fast, not slow. Just walked to her and placed it in her hands. "Read it," he said, out loud, "since you're already talking." The crowd went silent. My mother unfolded the will. Her face changed 3 times in 5 seconds. Confusion first, like she was looking at something she didn't recognize. Then horror, real horror, the kind you can't fake. Then rage. The color went out of her cheeks, and her jaw tightened, and she looked up, not at Daniel, at the 73 people who had just heard her lie. And she knew they knew. She just didn't know yet that Daniel had a second copy in his car. And so did I. I was 34 then, working dispatch for a regional trucking company, which meant I spent most of my days on a headset while my father was quietly getting his affairs in order without telling anyone why. My name is David, and the only reason that matters is because my father handed me something 9 months before he died that I spent the next year wishing I had opened sooner. He called me into his study on a Tuesday night. Nothing unusual about that. He was a retired civil engineer who still kept his desk like a flight deck, everything squared off, pens in a line, calendar marked in pencil. But this time he wasn't looking at blueprints or tax documents. He was holding an envelope, plain white, no writing on the outside. I asked what it was. He said, "Don't open it until I'm gone." Then he looked at me, really looked the way he used to when I was a kid, and I'd told him something that didn't quite add up. "But don't let your mother be the only one who knows what's in it." I asked him what he meant. He wasn't sick yet, at least not that anyone had told me. He was 62, still walking 2 miles every morning, still climbing ladders to clean his own gutters. He handed me the envelope and said, "Your mother loves you." Paused, "But she loves being loved more." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I took the envelope, drove to my bank the next morning, and put it in my safe deposit box. Called my brother Daniel afterward. He was 41, ran a flooring installation crew, built like our father but talked like our mother. I told him Dad gave me an envelope. Daniel laughed and said Dad had always been dramatic, but he took his own envelope the next week. I never asked what was in his. He never asked about mine. A month later, we got the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer. 6 to 8 months if he didn't do treatment, maybe a year if he did. My mother started crying in the doctor's office before the oncologist finished the sentence. But she wasn't looking at my father. She was looking at the door, watching who was coming in, who was walking past, who might see her cry. Daniel saw it. I saw it too. I just pretended I didn't. My father started chemo 3 weeks later, and the night before his first round, he asked me to promise him something. He was sitting in the same study chair, thinner already, but his voice hadn't changed. He said, "Don't let her rewrite it. Not after I'm gone." I said, "Rewrite what?" He said, "The story. She's already started." Then he closed his eyes like he was tired of talking. But he wasn't wrong. I just didn't know yet how right he was. The last 5 months of my father's life were measured in chemotherapy cycles and white blood cell counts. But my mother measured them differently. She was at the hospital every day. I'll give her that. Arrived by 9, stayed until visiting hours ended. But she was rarely in his room. She was in the hallway, phone pressed to her ear, voice pitched just loud enough to carry. She told her sister that watching him fade was breaking her. She told the nurses she didn't know how she'd go on. She told the hospital chaplain she was praying for strength. And all of that was true in its own way, I guess. But she wasn't in the chair next to his bed. She was outside the door, performing being inside it. My father didn't complain. He never did. He just lay there watching the ceiling, the morphine drip clicking every few seconds. And when a nurse came in, he'd say thank you the same way he'd said it his whole life. Quiet, like he didn't want to be a bother. Patricia drove down 3 weeks before the end. My father's sister. She lived in Vermont, taught high school biology for 30 years, never married, never performed anything for anyone. She showed up with a suitcase and a paperback and slept in the chair next to his bed. Not on the pull-out couch in the waiting room. Not in my mother's guest bedroom. In the chair. For 7 nights. My mother told everyone how devoted Patricia was. What a blessing to have family who would drop everything. But Patricia wasn't performing. She was just sitting there, holding his hand when he woke up confused, reading her book when he slept, not talking about how hard it was, not telling anyone how strong she was. That's the difference. And my mother felt it. One afternoon, Patricia pulled me aside in the hospital cafeteria. We were drinking coffee from styrofoam cups, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and she didn't look at me when she spoke. She said, "Your mother asked me yesterday if Arthur had changed his will recently." I asked why she would ask that. Patricia said, "Because she's worried he didn't leave her everything." A long pause. I could hear the ice machine dumping in the kitchen. I said, "Should he?" Patricia looked at me then. Just looked. No anger. No judgment. Just the tired expression of someone who had watched my mother operate for 30 years and had learned not to expect anything different. "You should ask him yourself," she said. I didn't. I told myself he was too sick. I told myself it wasn't the time. I told myself a dozen reasons why bringing it up would be cruel. But the truth was simpler. I didn't want to know, because if I asked and he told me something I couldn't ignore, then I'd have to do something about it. And doing something meant conflict. Meant choosing. Meant my mother looking at me the way she looked at Patricia. So I didn't ask. That was my first mistake. My father died on a Tuesday at 3:17 in the morning. I was there. Daniel was there. Patricia was there. My mother was at home. Asleep. She told everyone later that she couldn't bear to watch. That the waiting had broken her. That she needed one night of rest before the end. At the funeral home 2 days later, she picked out the casket. The most expensive one. Polished mahogany with brass handles. She said your father would have wanted it. My father drove a 20-year-old Ford Ranger with a crack in the windshield and a seat cover held together with duct tape. He patched his own shoes with rubber cement and kept a coffee can of spare screws in the kitchen drawer because he couldn't throw anything away that might be useful someday. But she said he would have wanted it, and no one corrected her. Not then. The day after my father died, my mother called Harold, the family attorney, 72 years old, had outlived most of his clients, still wore bow ties, and kept a calendar on his desk from 1992 because he said he liked the picture of the lighthouse. She wanted to know when the will was being read. Harold told her there was no reading. The will was filed with the probate court. Copies went directly to the beneficiaries. That was standard practice. Had been for years. My mother said, "I'm the beneficiary." Harold was quiet for a moment, just long enough for her to feel it. Then he said, "You're one of them." Daniel called me that night. I was sitting in my kitchen, still in the same clothes I'd worn to the hospital, a plate of food going cold in front of me. He didn't say hello, just started talking. He said, "She's going to lie at the funeral. You know that, right?" I told him we didn't know that. She was grieving. People say things at funerals. Emotional things. Inaccurate things. Daniel said, "I know her. She's going to stand over his grave and tell everyone he left her everything. She's already practicing. I heard her on the phone with Aunt Carol this afternoon. Arthur made sure I'd be taken care of." Those exact words. I asked what he wanted to do about it. He said, "I want to hand her the will while she's still talking." I thought he was joking. The way Daniel joked about everything. The cancer, the funeral costs, the casket my mother picked out. Dark humor was how he survived. I laughed. He didn't laugh back. And I realized he wasn't joking. I drove to Harold's office the next morning. Old brick building downtown, stairs that creaked, a receptionist who had worked there since before I was born. Harold was already at his desk, reading glasses halfway down his nose, the will spread out in front of him. He confirmed what we already knew. The house went to my mother for her lifetime, then to Daniel and me equally. Everything else, the savings, the investments, the small life insurance policy, split 3 ways. My mother, Daniel, me. Then Harold looked at me over his glasses and said, Your mother asked me to change the wording. 2 years ago, your father refused. I asked what wording. He turned the will around and pointed to a line. I read it. I leave my interest in the marital home at 1427 Cedar Street to my wife, Diane, for the term of her natural life, in recognition of 35 years of marriage. 35 years. They'd been married 48 when he died. I asked what she wanted it to say. Harold said, beloved wife of 50 years. He closed the file. She said it was a small thing. Just words. Your father said he wouldn't lie in a legal document. Even for her. Especially for her, I think. I sat there for a long moment. Then I said, he knew she'd lie at the funeral. Harold didn't contradict me. He just said he knew she'd try. That's why he gave you copies. I said he wanted us to stop her. Harold took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, the same way my father used to clean his. And when he put them back on, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not sympathy, not warning, something older. He wanted you to have the truth, Harold said. What you do with it, that's not in the will. I drove home with my hands tied on the wheel. The envelope from my father was still in my safe deposit box. I hadn't opened it. I had told myself I was waiting until the funeral was over, until things settled, until I was ready. But that wasn't true. The truth was simpler and uglier. I hadn't opened it because I already knew what was inside. The same thing Harold had just shown me. The same thing Daniel had already read. My father giving us the truth and trusting us to decide what came next. That was the part one couldn't carry. Not the truth, the choice. My mother planned everything. The music, the speakers, the order of service. My father's name was on the front of the program in gold script. But everything inside was about her. The cover read, "A loving wife remembers." That wasn't a typo. The service started. Pastor read some scripture. Prayed. Then my mother stood up before he could give the eulogy. She walked to the podium. Black dress. Pearls. Hair done that morning. She stood there letting everyone see her face. The grief. The courage. The performance. She talked about their marriage. How much she loved him. How she'd carry on. She didn't mention they'd slept in separate rooms for 12 years. That my father had moved into the guest bedroom after a fight about money neither of them could remember the next morning. That they'd eaten dinner in silence most nights. Television turned up because conversation was harder than static. Daniel's hand was in his jacket pocket, knuckles white, holding the will. I put my hand on his arm, squeezed. He looked at me, but kept his hand where it was. The graveside was cold. October wind off the fields. Vault still open. Dirt piled to the side under artificial grass. Pastor said a few more words. Then my mother stepped forward, positioned herself so everyone could see. Casket behind her. Open grave at her feet. 73 people spread in a semicircle. Your father told me before he died that he wanted me to have everything. She paused, looked around. I didn't want to talk about money today, but he made me promise. He said make sure everyone knows. He said I want Diane to have it all. Daniel pulled out the will. I grabbed his wrist, whispered not here. Not like this. She's still your mother. He looked at me. Come. There is no other like this. This is the only chance. I held his wrist one more second, then let go. He walked forward. Crowd parted. He stopped next to my mother, handed her the folded document. Read it, out loud, since you're already talking. Daniel reached my mother. She was still talking. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of. That's the kind of man he was. Her voice steady, the performance running on muscle memory now. She saw Daniel step up next to her, and her face flickered. Just for a second. Then she kept going because stopping meant admitting something was wrong. Daniel held out the folded document. Didn't say anything. Just held it. My mother looked at it. Then at him. Then at the 73 people watching. She took it. She said, "What is this?" Daniel said the will. The real one. Read it. My mother said, "This isn't the time." Daniel didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. He said, "You're standing over his grave, lying to everyone who loved him. This is exactly the time." She unfolded the will. The paper shook in her hands. The crowd was so quiet I could hear the pages catch on each other as she turned them. I watched her face. We all did. Confusion first, like she was looking at something she didn't recognize. Then horror. Real horror. The kind that drains color and drops your jaw before your brain catches up. Then rage. Her jaw tightened. Her cheeks went white. 3 changes in about 5 seconds. Every single person saw it. She looked up, not at Daniel, at the crowd, at the 73 people who had just heard her say everything. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time in my life, I watched my mother have absolutely nothing to say. The funeral director stepped forward. Older guy, maybe 60, had done hundreds of these. He asked if everything was all right. Professional voice, trying to contain whatever was happening. My mother looked at the will, looked at the grave, looked at the crowd again. She didn't speak. She just walked to her car. The will was still in her hands, crushed against her chest like she was carrying something that might break her if she let it go. She didn't look back. Not once. The limousine door closed. The engine started. She drove away. 73 people stood around an open grave in October wind, and no one said a word. The crowd didn't move. 73 people standing around an open grave, October wind picking up, and no one knew what to do. My mother's car was already gone. The limousine driver had pulled away without being told. Just followed her. Marcus stepped in, the funeral director. Older guy, gray hair, had done this long enough to handle anything. He started directing people to their cars. Quiet voice. Steady hands. No questions about what had just happened. He was a professional, but as he passed me and Daniel, he looked at us. Just once. Gave one nod. That was all. Patricia came over. My father's sister. Still wearing the same black coat she'd had for 10 years. She stood next to us for a moment before she spoke. Watching the cars pull away. Watching people stare at us through their windows. She said, "Your father told me he gave you copies. I thought you'd use them privately." Daniel said, "She had her chance to be private. She chose a crowd." Patricia was quiet for a long time. Longer than I expected. Then she said, "She'll never forgive you." I thought about that. About what forgiveness even meant from someone who had spent my whole life performing love instead of feeling it. Daniel answered before I could. He said, "She never loved us. She loved being seen loving us." That's different. Patricia didn't argue. She just put her hand on Daniel's shoulder and walked to her car. Elena came next. Family friend. Knew my father for 40 years. They'd worked together at the engineering firm before he retired. She was slow walking now. Bad hip, but she made her way over to us. Stopped right where my mother had been standing. She said, "I heard what your mother said. I heard what your father's will says. I'll remember both." Then she walked away. I stood there watching her go, and that's when I understood. The crowd wasn't just witnesses. They were the archive. My mother couldn't rewrite this. Couldn't call people later and explain it away. Couldn't say she'd been misquoted or misunderstood. 73 people saw her face change. Saw her read those pages. Saw her walk to her car without a word. The story was already out of her hands. It belonged to everyone who had been standing there in the cold. Daniel looked at me. "You okay?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Yeah, me neither." We walked to his truck. The cemetery was empty now, except for Marcus and his crew waiting to close the vault. I didn't look back, but I felt those 73 pairs of eyes all the way to the parking lot. 3 days later, my mother called Daniel. Not me. She knew better. She said she wanted both copies of the will. Daniel said no. She said, "I'm your mother." Daniel said, "You're someone who lied over my father's grave while he could still hear you." She screamed. Not cried. Screamed. The kind of sound that comes from somewhere below the throat. "You humiliated me in front of everyone." Daniel didn't raise his voice. He said, "You humiliated yourself. We just didn't stop you." She said, "Your father would never have wanted this." Daniel said, "Our father gave us the copies. He wanted exactly this." She hung up. He called me right after. Told me everything. His voice was steady but tired. I asked what we did now. He said, "Now we live. She'll figure out how to do the same." My mother didn't call me. She sent Harold instead. He showed up at my apartment on a Thursday afternoon. Same bow tie, same briefcase. Sat on my couch like he was conducting business as usual. He said, "Your mother wants to know if you'll surrender your copy of the will." I said no. He said she's considering a legal challenge to the distribution. I asked on what grounds. He said undue influence. I asked from who. Harold looked at me, didn't blink. He said, "She hasn't decided yet." I sat there for a moment. Let that land. She hadn't decided yet, meaning she was shopping for an accusation, trying to find someone to blame for the fact that my father had told the truth in writing. I said, "Tell her I'll see her in court. Tell her I'll bring the 73 witnesses. Tell her I'll bring Patricia. Tell her I'll bring the funeral director. Tell her I'll bring Elena." She wanted a crowd at the grave. She can have a crowd in court. Harold nodded. Didn't write anything down. Didn't need to. He'd been a lawyer for 50 years. He knew a lost case when he heard one. He stood up, adjusted his coat, and walked to the door. Then he stopped, looked back at me. He said, "Your father would have been proud of you." Then he left. I sat alone in my apartment for a long time after that, thinking about what Harold said, thinking about my mother shopping for someone to blame, thinking about Daniel's voice on the phone. Now we live. Like it was that simple. Like living wasn't the hardest part. For months later, the estate settled. My mother got her share. Daniel and I got ours. She stayed in the house. She had a life estate, which meant she could live there until she died, but she couldn't sell it, and she couldn't leave it to anyone else. My father planned that too. Harold delivered the final documents to my apartment. Same briefcase, same bow tie. He sat down and spread the papers across my coffee table and walked me through each one. Signed here. Initial there. I signed everything without reading it. I'd read enough. Then Harold said, "Your mother asked me to tell you something." I asked what. He said, "She said you chose him over me." I thought about that. About what choosing meant. About whether standing next to the truth was the same as taking a side. I said he didn't ask us to choose. He just told us the truth. She's the one who made it a choice. Harold gathered his papers, stood up, paused at the door the same way he had 4 months ago. He said, "I've been practicing law since 1972. I've never seen anything like that funeral." Then he left. Daniel called that night, asked if I wanted to meet. Not at the house, not at the cemetery, a diner off the highway between our two towns. The kind of place with vinyl booze and coffee that had been sitting too long. We sat across from each other. Ordered pie, apple for him, cherry for me. We didn't talk about our mother. Not once. We talked about our father. The way he used to fix things in the garage and never throw away a bolt because it might be useful someday. The way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. The way he planned for everything, including this. Daniel pushed his fork through the crust and said, "Do you think he knew she'd lie?" I said he knew. That's why he gave us the copies. Daniel said, "Do you think he knew we'd use them at the funeral?" I thought about my father's face that night in the study. The way he'd looked at me. Not asking, not demanding, just trusting. I said, "I think he hoped we would. But I think he loved us enough to let us decide." Daniel nodded, ate another bite of pie, didn't say anything else. We finished in silence. Paid separate checks, like we always did. Walked out into the parking lot. The sun was going down, and the sky was the color of old asphalt. Daniel put his hand on my shoulder, held it there for a second. Then he got his truck and drove away. I stood there watching his taillights disappear, thinking about my mother alone in that house, thinking about my father in the ground, thinking about Harold's words. "You chose him over me." But that wasn't what happened. My father handed me the truth. My mother handed me a performance. I just picked the one that didn't ask me to pretend. 1 year after the funeral, I went to the cemetery alone. The grave had settled. Grass had grown over the bare dirt. Someone had put flowers on it. Small white ones in a simple vase. Not my mother's style. She sent arrangements that looked like hotel lobbies. These were different. Quiet. Probably Patricia. I stood there for a long time. The wind was cold again. Same October sky. Same fields stretching out toward the trees. I didn't say anything. He knew. I took out my copy of the will. I'd carried it for almost 2 years. In my glove compartment, in my jacket pocket that day, at the graveside. Folded and unfolded, so many times the creases were soft. I opened it one more time. Read the line my father had written. This reflects my considered judgment after 35 years of marriage. Considered judgment, not love, not anger, just the truth as he saw it after 35 years of sleeping next to someone and then not sleeping next to her. After raising 2 boys and watching his wife perform devotion instead of feeling it. After deciding that honesty mattered more than comfort. I folded the will again. Didn't leave it at the grave. That would have been performative. My father hated performance. I walked back to my car. My phone buzzed. Daniel. A text. She called. She wants to have dinner. Just the 3 of us. I typed, "What did you say?" He typed, "I said no." I typed, "Me too." I put my phone away. Started the car. Drove home. The will was in my glove compartment. I didn't look at it again. I didn't need to. The truth doesn't have to be carried to be remembered. You just have to stop pretending it isn't there. That's what my father taught me. Not in words. In paper. In ink. In a document he signed, knowing exactly what would happen after he was gone. The 73 people saw it. Daniel handed it over. I stood there and let it happen. That's the story. Not revenge. Not reconciliation. Just a son who finally stopped protecting someone from the consequences of a lie she chose to tell. And a father who trusted him enough to hand him the truth before he died. I'm over it where silence ends. When did you stop pretending someone in your life was different than they actually were?